The Barbarian War, Chapters 39 and 40, The Lacuna Gambit. Chapter 39. According to the display beside her bed, it was deep into the wee hours of the morning when an insistent alarm woke her from her sleep. Leandra took a minute to throw on a dressing gown and run a brush through her hair, giving her a chance to compose herself, before answering the call. Admiral Matavosian, looking far more composed than she did, stared back at her. "We just received word from our scouts," he informed her. "A large Konhim fleet has been spotted near the boundary of Tetrarchy space." The Prime Minister closed her eyes and nodded. "And so it begins," she thought to herself. "Where?" she asked him. "On a direct course to Sakip," he said grimly. "Our forces are already en route." Sakip was in a Phipteran world, on the far edge of the Chenur cluster. "It would seem that our intel was correct," she said with a meager smile. "Will you have enough time to prepare?" "We'll be ready," he confirmed. "It'll be tight, but we'll make it." There was nothing else to be said. No last-minute orders, no rousing speeches, no reminders of what was at stake. They'd done everything they could think of. They would stand, or they would fall. Any words from her now seemed trite and hollow, so in the end she opted for simplicity. "Good hunting, Admiral," she said softly as he disappeared from the screen. Diaksh Chugaz. Uidan's body seemed to hum with anticipation as they neared the worlds of their ancient enemies. Somehow he had always known that he would be the one to fulfill the oath of their forebears, and as the fleet prepared for their first strike, he could feel their excitement flowing into him. It was a far more intoxicating sensation than any drink, and as the blue-green world appeared on their sensors, he bared his teeth as they prepared for the kill. "Diaksh, I am reading a number of vessels in the vicinity of the planet," his tactical officer informed him. Chugaz rose to his feet. "I want hard data on those ships immediately," he ordered. The crew worked furiously to determine the nature of the threat as their scans zoomed in on the point targets. Within a handful of minutes, they had their answer. "Diaksh, I am reading a number of what appear to be transports," the officer reported, as well as... The officer froze in mid-sentence as the data firmed up. Chugaz's eyes widened in amazement as he moved closer to the display, confirming his suspicions. And then he threw back his head and laughed. "So, all they have left to face us are freighters and relics." Admiral Matavosian held his breath as he waited for the Konhim to respond. This was the crucial moment when they would learn if their plans had all been for nothing. The squadrons of aging comets and HKs, remnants of the previous war, were all he had left to fight with. As they'd built the new navy from scratch, the old fighters and gunboats had been parked near the dwarf planet Eris, far beyond Pluto's orbit near the inner border of the Kuiper Belt. During the century of forced demilitarization, it had housed a highly classified research facility, hidden from the triumvirate, designing ships and weapons in case they were ever needed. It made for a convenient dumping ground of obsolete hardware, but handy enough should they ever be needed again. First rule of military logistics: nothing ever gets thrown away. Getting them back in service and manned had been no easy task. The HKs had been especially difficult, given they were designed specifically with Ronin pilots in mind. Without any sort of life support system whatsoever, converting them to human use, or for anyone else for that matter, had proven impossible in the time available. There were many Ronin pilots still around, though only a handful anywhere near Earth when the call went out. After the attack on the shipyards during the minister's coup, there was a great deal of mistrust between the races, but there was literally no one else who could fly them. So instead they'd simply towed the birds to the Chenur cluster, where they linked up with waiting pilots. At least since they were artificial life forms, the refamiliarization process had gone quickly and smoothly. And now it all came down to this, one last desperate gamble. Matavosian watched as the Konhim fleet came burning in hard, and why not? It wasn't like he had anything that could stop them. But that didn't mean there weren't a couple of cards left to play. He nodded at his communications officer, who opened a channel. "Matavosian to all combat squadrons, stand by. Freighter captains, begin your run." "Diaksh, the freighters are moving," the tactical officer reported. Chugaz Uidan watched closely as the transports began racing away from the fleet. There was the question of what they were doing there in the first place, though perhaps it was something as simple as bringing in last-minute supplies. That they were now desperately trying to escape his clutches was unsurprising, since their arrival had apparently caught them by surprise. And then he cursed in anger, as the sensor readings suddenly turned to hash. "The freighters are jettisoning debris of some kind," the officer disclosed, after double-checking his readings. "It is interfering with our sensors." Mollified, Chugaz returned to his chair, chuckling in amusement. "They think they can hide from us," he laughed. "Time for us to show them the error of their ways." The freighters redlined their engines as they ran for safety, disgorging chaff as fast as they could dump it out of their holds. It wasn't much, Admiral Matavosian mused, but hopefully it would buy them a few minutes' grace. For a few minutes was all he needed. "All units, stand by. We're only going to get one shot at this," he cautioned them as the ragtag fleet collectively held its breath. "That's it, just a little closer," he whispered, as a knowing smile began to play at his lips. "Come into my parlor," said the spider to the fly. "All ships, attack!" Chugaz Uiden roared as the fleet surged forward. The humans could play all the games they wanted, but nothing was going to stop them now. If they thought scattered strips of metal were going to save them, it only showed how truly desperate they were. He would smash their pathetic armada as easily as he had destroyed the one over Gok, and when he had finished turning their antiquated ships into wreckage, he would turn his attention to his pursuers. Let that fool Giaj Guyaz and his alien allies come. He would finish them off as well, and then there would be nothing left in the quadrant to stand in his way. The Konhim fleet raced into the teeth of the waiting fighters as they began charging weapons. There were so many ways the plan could have gone wrong. When the Prime Minister had briefed him on Lacuna, he could see it for the forlorn hope it was. No one was sure if it would even work. But the scientists and engineers running the computer models assured him the math and physics were sound, and given the paucity of any other ideas, he had reluctantly signed on, even if as far as he knew, nothing like it had ever been attempted under real-world conditions. Well, that wasn't exactly true. Something very much like it had been tried exactly once, over the Ronin planet U-12. "Nadezhda Parisi, I hope you're watching," Admiral Matavosian prayed fervently before giving the order. "Full power to the generators!" he shouted, as the massive planetary shield generators, stripped from a dozen nearby worlds, came online. In the space of a millisecond, the bulk of the Konhim fleet suddenly found themselves trapped on the inside of the shield. It wasn't a perfect sphere, and at least a quarter of the enemy ships had been outside the zone when the shield snapped into place. The energy field crackled and hummed with power, instantly shredding into component atoms the unlucky vessels the barrier had intersected when it materialized into existence. "After the stragglers!" he ordered as the comets and HKs opened fire, diving against the Konhim ships they'd missed. They had to keep them away from the generators, long enough for Admiral Fujimoto and the rest of the fleet to arrive. Admiral Matavosian gripped the mic tightly, his eyes blazing with fervent madness. "Hold the line, damn you! Hold the line!" Chapter 40. Dyaksh Chugaz. Uidan leapt to his feet in shock as his armada suddenly found itself trapped within the shield's bubble. What manner of trickery was this? But once he forced himself to calm down and actually think, he realized the situation was far from catastrophic. In fact, this tactic was a sign of just how desperate the enemy was, for if they'd had any other ships in reserve, they would have produced them by now. No. The old fighters were all they had, and once he smashed his way free of this energy field, he would annihilate them. "Order the ships outside the shield to destroy the generators!" he snarled, before turning his attention to the tactical officer. "Arm the breakers and fire!" The HK squadron charged forward, firing a volley of antimatter projectiles while the comets covered their flanks, the Konhim answering with a flight of missiles in return. The agile fighters dodged and jinked their way through the swarm of death, destroying any that threatened the Ronin gunboats. The HK had always been envisioned as an offensive platform, relying on its heavy armor to shrug off damage. It was all axe and no shield, whereas the comets could be used in either role. By covering for their big brothers, they increased the effectiveness of their armada by an order of magnitude, as they fought to keep the enemy at bay. But the Konhim warriors they faced weren't Tyros, but battle-hardened professionals, and they knew the capabilities of the ships they faced intimately. They splintered off into separate groups to deny the HK's amassed target, coming in on oblique trajectories to strip away the fighters, as suddenly it was the comets who were fighting for their lives, the Konhim charging in for the kill. The trapped Konhim fleet fired a barrage of breaker missiles in one heavy gasp, sending them arcing away towards the shield. Chugaz-Iden watched earnestly as they sprinted towards self-immolation, impacting against the field in groups of 2s and 3s as they detonated. The effect was devastating. Massive surges of energy sent shockwaves through the fleet, refracting and rebounding from dozens of point sources like handfuls of gravel tossed into a still pond. Alarms wailed throughout the flagship Resolve, as systems were suddenly overloaded and shorted out. The ships of the Armada were tossed about like toys as the concussive waves reverberated within the field, until finally ebbing away as they canceled each other out. Chugaz-Uidan clawed his way back to his feet, the smell of smoke and ozone heavy on the bridge. "Report! What is the status of the shield?" The crew struggled to find their way back to their stations, working to restore crippled systems before the tactical officer was able to respond. "Diaksh, the shield is still in place," he said in astonishment. Fury twisted his face beyond all recognition as he railed at the news. "Another salvo!" he ordered. The planetary shield was a marvel of science and engineering, the pinnacle of triumvirate achievement, but it was not without its flaws. While seemingly a smooth, uninterrupted sphere, in fact it more closely resembled one of Carl Fabergé's finely crafted Easter eggs, an intricate puzzle fitting together perfectly and utterly remarkable to behold. The Konhim breaker missile had been designed to exploit the seams and fracture lines within the energy matrix, shattering the sphere with a tap on just the right spot, instead of hurling massive broadsides against the shield wall itself, to no effect. With a simple sphere, the math used to locate the fracture lines was a straightforward exercise in n-dimensional multilinear subspace tensor calculus. But the shield bubble hastily thrown together by Admiral Matavosian was not a simple sphere. Far from it. In fact, if any three-dimensional object could be held up as a model of what they'd created, the closest parallel would be a potato. A rather lumpy and possibly malformed potato. From an engineering aspect, it was an abomination. From a tactical standpoint, however, it was a godsend. The clean, simple fracture lines in the standard model, the ones exploited by the breaker missile, now radiated in 100 different directions. Any hit along those seams would be quickly dampened out, the energy whisked away as it dissipated. But there was a catch. A skyscraper is constructed with massive beams and girders, not tinker toys. The very structure that gave Matavosian's shield its resiliency was also its weakest link. Hit it hard enough and it would shatter, which is why the Admiral had insisted on quadruple redundancy. It had required them to strip out the generators from a dozen nearby worlds, and in theory, when a generator was knocked out, the ones remaining would accept the increased load and maintain the field. In theory. As the salvo of breaker missiles detonated against the shield, Admiral Matavosian watched grimly as dozens of the shield generators exploded in incandescent balls of plasma. The energy field spiked as the remaining generators took the strain and held. For the moment. Major Parisi had used her bubble guns to crush the individual ships caught within the field, but there was no chance of repeating her feat here. As it was, they were barely managing to keep the shield from completely collapsing. Besides, it had never been the intent of Lacuna to destroy the Konhim, merely delay them until Admiral Fujimoto's joint fleet could arrive. Their battle wasn't against Chugaz-Uidan, but time itself. The second volley of missiles was delayed, while damage control parties aboard the Konhim Armada rushed to repair the systems wrecked by the first barrage. Chugaz-Uidan stormed and raged as the engineers fought to bring them back online, but finally, they gave their grudging consent. Another broadside of missiles hurled themselves against the shield, once again sending shockwaves throughout the enclosed space. This time at least they were prepared, riding out the undulating currents as they struggled to see if their attack was successful. Once more the shield mocked their efforts. "Again!" screamed Chugaz-Uidan. A flight of comets disappeared in actinic fire as the shield generators they were defending exploded. Many of the Konhim vessels pressing them were wiped away as well, but that wasn't Admiral Matavosian's greatest fear. No one would ever confuse him with Engineer Scotty, but even he could see the shield was visibly weakened by the latest fusillade. There was no doubt in his mind that Chugaz Aiden was busy readying a third salvo, and this time, all bets were off. Chugaz Uidan was done playing it safe. He'd ordered a double volley of breakers to be fired, despite the obvious risks. They needed to escape now, quickly, before Jiaj Guyaz and his alien allies arrived. He could easily defeat each smaller fleet in turn, once he brought his forces to bear, but if they managed to link up, then things suddenly became much dicier. He still liked his odds, but he had not risen to power by gambling. His every move had been determined by the ruthless elimination of random chance. The only horse races he bet on, assuming for the moment the Konhim had such events, were the ones he'd fixed himself. Every ship in the fleet was braced and ready as the third flight of breaker missiles sprinted towards the shield. The armada seemed to collectively hold its breath, waiting for confirmation as the missiles detonated. Even with the extra precautions they'd taken, their ships were tossed about once more. But this time, the shock waves quickly disappeared, as a feral grin of triumph appeared on Chugaz Uidan's face. Admiral Matavosian could only watch in horror as the shield flickered and disappeared. "God help us all," he whispered.